Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Hope for Mental Health community. I'm so glad you've joined us today. You probably see these balloons over my shoulder. It's because this is our third anniversary. We have been doing the Hope for Mental Health community for 3 years. That's like 36 episodes if my math is right, but I don't trust my math. So you might want to anyway, this is our third anniversary and we're so glad that you are here. Thanks for joining us. Before I introduce our guest today, I want to tell you all about a very special event that I'm going to be hosting on Saturday, May the 15th at 10 o'clock Pacific time, which means, you add in your hours for wherever you live, but it's a Breathe event for parents. So moms, dads, couples, single parents, you're all welcome to join us for an hour, a Zoom call, where I'm going to be just talking to you, encouraging you, as those of you who live with children of any age who have a serious mental illness, and be taking a lot of your questions and hopefully get to do some interaction in that way. So again, that's May 15th. You can sign up for that at kwarren.com/breathe. And that then takes me to today. So today our guest is Dr. Anita Phillips, and we're calling this Trauma, Faith, and Culture. Dr. Phillips is a trauma therapist. She's a life coach and a minister, and she is an expert at unraveling the human experience. She's known for her paradigm shifting insights at the intersection of mental health, faith, and culture. She holds degrees from the University of Maryland and Regent University, and she completed a National Institute of Health funded postdoctoral fellowship at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. She serves on the advisory board for the Boris L. Henson Foundation, and she's on the Faith Communities Task Force for the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention. She makes her home in Baltimore, where she ministers at Kingdom Life Church with her husband, who is the pastor, Pastor Michael Phillips. This week, I got to spend some time with Dr. Anita, some extended time, and it was incredible. And I know you're going to love her. And I can't wait for you to hear my conversation with this very wise and gifted leader. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Anita Phillips. Well, so this is an exciting moment for me to get to interview you, Dr. Anita Phillips. We have gotten acquainted in this last year, and as I said in the introduction, but just actually have you, face to face. We're looking at each other across Zoom, and I had the privilege of just being with you this week in person, and so that made it even more special. But thank you so much for being with us today, and I just want you to start by telling the audience, I've already given them all your credentials and all those wonderful things, but just you as a person. Tell us about yourself, how mental illness has impacted you and your family. I think it really helps our audience to feel like they can identify with our presenter when they know more about you as a person. So sure. Just tell us some of that.
Yeah, first, thanks for having me. I'm so honored to be here and having the chance to talk to this incredible community that you've created, where people are seeking support for the way that mental health and illness is impacting their lives. I identify with that deeply. I became a trauma therapist because I survived a lot of trauma, and it really started early on in my life at that intersection with mental illness. I'm a pastor's daughter, so I grew up in a pastor's home full of faith. But I had an older sister who developed serious mental illnesses as a child and really started showing some symptoms as early as 6 or 7 years old. I found out later from my mom, but she was 6 years older than I was. And so when I was about 6 or 7 myself, she began waking up in the middle of the night with terrifying hallucinations. She would see demons standing in the door of the bedroom that she and I shared. And so she would wake up and just these blood curdling screams in the middle of the night. And it happened the first time. I remember just not knowing what to do. The way our house was set up, it would take time for my parents to hear her screaming from another floor in a part of the house and get up there. And it seemed that my dad was the only person who could comfort her. And we started out just really praying about it, right? This is spiritual warfare. This is some kind of demonic attack. But it didn't change it. And the experiences got more and more frequent. So even at that very young age, I was having this experience in the middle of the night. Do I pull the covers over my head and hope that it stops soon? Or do I run through a door that has demons that I can't see, but I believe must be there because she saw them, to go and get my parents for help? And so, yeah, I've been living at the intersection of faith and mental health and illness forever. And it brought a lot of questions into our lives. This is the early 80s, so pediatric psychiatry was barely a thing at that time. And it wasn't that my parents were rejecting the idea that she had a mental illness, it wasn't even an option to explain what was happening, right? So as she got older and began to kind of act out, it was, is this a demonic attack, or is she just a bad kid, right? She's being a badly behaved kid. And that was the narrative that we had to work with as far as trying to make sense and meaning out of what's going on. And that's such a critical element of trauma, is the story that gets told. What does this mean? And what does this event in my life, this series of events in my life that's changing my life, mean to me? How will I tell the story? How will I apply meaning to it? That's one of the really difficult elements of trauma that I feel like we don't talk about enough.
My mind was full of questions. I was
Mm.
just jotting notes. Even I like to come back even to this
Mm.
this idea of, the in trauma is the story that gets told and the meaning that we put to that. So if you don't mind me asking, how long did it take before your family did put some
Mm.
more meaning to it? How long did that for you as a younger sibling? Maybe your
Mhm.
parents grasped something at one point, but how long for you before you could put some meaning to that, to her story and how it affected your story?
No, that's an excellent question. I asked my mom a similar question not too long ago, and her answer was, "I'm still putting meaning to that story." And it made so much sense because my sister actually passed away in 2016. She, as a result of her mental illnesses and them not being treated, she became addicted to drugs because she found out that drugs made the voices go away. And so then, of course, that addiction became its own problem. And so she spent decades kind of estranged at times from our family because of the addiction, and people listening know how that goes. And so she did finally get clean. Last 7 years of her life were as beautiful as they could be. But her body was very damaged from all of the years of addiction. So she had a heart attack at the young age of 47, which is the age I am now, incidentally. So I'm really just so young. But my mom and dad, as parents of a child with a mental illness, were still being traumatized the entire time. And so it really has been, since her death, just their opportunity to actually kind of have a narrative, to look back over it and make meaning out of the bigger picture, because they were being traumatized still. And so sometimes I think we don't give ourselves credit for being in the midst of a trauma. We're so wanting to come to conclusions, and it can be hard to do that when you're still suffering. For me, I think I was able to write a narrative sooner because I grew up, I left home. I was very angry with my sister. It took a long time for me to let go of the anger that I had towards her, and really the hatred. I know as Christians we don't like to talk about that much, but I hated her for a period of time. I just felt like, well, she's the bad kid who's always making it hard on our family. And so really my own education, going into social work and then becoming an addictions counselor myself, gave me a different perspective on what had happened to her. And that's how I was able to start to rewrite the story as a clinician. Spiritually, though, I didn't start rewriting the story until I was a PhD student, when I was purposely doing work to integrate faith and mental health. And I started finally getting some of the answers that I had had for God. My mom said once when I was a kid, "I know something's wrong with her." Her name was Valerie. "I know something's wrong with Valerie. I accept it, but I still want to understand what my Bible says about it." There was such a hole left for her, to not be able to get her finger on a scripture or a passage or an understanding that connected and translated between her spiritual understanding and the understanding in the natural world. And I took those questions on as well, because I wanted to understand, well, why isn't the prayer working? My parents were and are powerful people of God, and it was faith shaking for me, because I'm like, if God's not answering their prayers, why should I ask for anything ever? So that
Mm.
left spiritual questions for me. So when I became a PhD student, I wanted to really spend my time devoted to looking for the answers to those questions. And I feel like God did meet me there and gave me some insights that have been incredibly healing for families of faith.
There's so much there that you said.
Mm,
Truly, I mean, that mirrored some of our experiences with Matthew's, with my son's serious mental illness, his siblings' stories, their experiences, how they've come to make sense of it, see it in a different light after his death. We've had 8 years
mm,
since he passed away to try to sift through the pieces and connect some of the dots, and even connect feelings, connect with what was happening. You talked about how in the moment, you really are just trying to survive, especially if you have a loved one with serious mental illness.
yeah.
And I've talked to so many parents, so many family members who that would be exactly what they would say. When they're in it, in the moment, there isn't as much time to process it. Is just get through it,
Yeah.
just get through it, get to the next, take a few breaths in between the next crisis. And so there isn't often as much time to reflect. I think
Mhm.
as now, from the vantage point of my son has passed away, and now I look back, I read even my own journals, my own interchanges with him, exchanges with him, like on text or email, and they have a different. I read them differently now. I see them differently. I see more of what was going on. I see more of what was going on in me. I see the places where I was just desperately swimming in deep water, trying to keep from drowning myself and to keep him from drowning, figuratively.
Mhm.
And just how that story is even changing with time and space, to be able to look at it differently. I wonder, and if this is not something you want to share, that's totally fine, but it was about your sister. um, what sense did she make of her own story? Was
Mm.
there ever the place that she was able to, or did that remain an elusive thing for her as well?
No, I think she was able to make some good sense of her story at the end, because when she finally had that moment of breakthrough with her addiction, of course, she had been to rehab, you know,
Yeah,
a billion times.
yeah.
And my parents, we know we always would just keep trying. But when she finally had that breakthrough where all the things aligned that brought her out of the addiction, she actually got treatment for her mental illness. And, that's part of the problem. A lot of times we focus on addiction. If we have an addicted family member, that becomes our focus. But we really have to recognize that very often, and always when it comes to mental illness, addiction is like an infection in an open wound. The mental illness is the wound. The addiction, it gets in there and then it becomes its own infection. And we get so focused on clearing the infection, and we need to, but then if we don't clear the wound, then that's the issue. And that's why many people relapse. And so once the wound was also actually addressed and she got on medication and she was able to have some silence, I remember her telling me that she had been hearing voices her whole life. She didn't remember not hearing them. And so she thought it was normal,
Yeah.
but just that her voices were meaner than other people's. But she really didn't know that there was another life to live. And so when things got quiet, man, that was so freeing for her. She
Mm.
got married. A wonderful man
Oh,
married her, and it was just the most beautiful
oh,
years of her life. And that was something that God did. And I believe that was very healing for her, to be
yes.
adored the way she was by
Mm.
him. And they had 5 years together. And so I think that helped her make sense of it, to really be safe in the love. And
Mm.
so between the love and the quiet, she really
Mhm.
did find
That
some
is a
peace.
sweetness. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a
There's
beautiful
some
thing.
sweetness to that.
Yeah, very sweet. And my favorite pictures of her from her wedding and with him, because those were her biggest smiles that we saw in her lifetime. But she was able to recognize and accept, I have a mental illness. She was able to accept, she used methadone treatment for quite a while to help her get off drugs. And that's controversial, right? Because people are like, well, you're just addicted to a different drug. And I'm like, well, fine, this one's better than that one because it's not keeping you on the street. So let's go. So she was able to kind of let go of that Christian narrative of, I'm not clean and pure if I don't do it all myself. Like, I need help, I need medication, and that's okay. But she
You know,
also was able to take responsibility for some of the things that were just also her choice.
yeah.
and she took responsibility for that. So I thought that was a really beautiful balance.
It is. I'm
And we
just so
needed to hear
glad.
that.
I'm so glad
It
that
was
she
so good.
had those years.
Yeah, it was
Sometimes
good.
people don't get they don't get the sweetness here. And I'm so
Agreed.
grateful that she did, and even that your
Mhm.
family had those years with her.
True.
That is I just keep using the word sweet because it just feels like there's so much that was bitter, there's
Yes.
just so much that was
Yes.
bitter
Yeah.
for
And
all of you.
in our relationship too, as siblings, which was really a tender space, we were able to repair some of that,
So
and
great.
just this exchange apologies for not understanding when we didn't understand. And
Mm.
so it was good.
Well, this isn't on, I had given you some some big bucket topics that I wanted to ask you about, but you said something. I want to just maybe dive there for just a few seconds, totally
Sure.
not related to anything else that we, are going to be talking about. But you mentioned the fact that you said she was on methadone for
Hmm.
a while as an aid to help her stay sober from,
Yeah.
I'm guessing, heroin,
Yeah.
opioids, whatever.
Hmm.
So just from your background with as an addiction counselor and stuff, there might be some people. I'd love to hear just your take on that, because I am not experienced in that area, widely experienced, but what I have heard that made sense to me was the idea. Well, let me just back up one step. My younger brother was a heroin addict for
Mm.
quite some time. And so our family has walked through, he's been clean and sober for 30 years now. So this really was in the
Awesome.
past. But when he was a younger man, he did have a pretty serious heroin addiction. And so I'm familiar with methadone and Suboxone and, a lot
Hmm.
of those other drugs that are used to help people, wean off or not be on heroin. So that was the viewpoint that I had, that if you were taking methadone or Suboxone or something else, rather than heroin or another opioid, that was bad. Kind of like you
Right.
said, that Christian narrative of, well, you're not
Hmm.
really clean, you're not really sober, you've just traded one drug for the other.
Right.
Now that can happen. But
Hmm.
what I've learned was just about that. Just wanted to hear you make sure I'm understanding this right, because I think I'm right on this. That sometimes that the drugs change the brain enough over long
Exactly.
periods of use that it is almost impossible to not that the brain has changed and to not have some opioid, Suboxone or methadone, um, then it will be very difficult to maintain life,
Right.
sobriety, health, hold a job, do all those things. And that the medication assisted treatment, right, MAP,
Hmm.
MAP. So that's my non-expert understanding of it. It's changed my view of that, to
Hmm.
know that when people's brain have changed, it almost is more of a medicine, if you will, than a drug to get high or to deal with your pain.
Yeah,
Did that make
absolutely.
sense? I mean, so
You
just
nailed it 100%.
okay,
That's
okay.
exactly what it is. So for
But for
people that
somebody who
maybe,
maybe doesn't really understand that, or
mhm,
really has trouble with that concept, can you just give us a little bit, because you are a believer, you are a Christian, you are coming from
100%.
that faith perspective, and maybe could help some folks who are struggling seeing it through that lens.
Sure. So what I'll do, I'll talk about on the practical side and then the biblical side. So first, just on the practical side, I used to be one of those people where I felt like, well, you're still not off drugs. Why don't you just stop using drugs? And if you've never been heavily addicted to a drug, it's really hard to understand what it's like. But I was working as a social worker, one of my first jobs as a social worker in my 20s, at a center for young men who were in the juvenile justice system. And so they were incarcerated and they were going to a work rehab place every day. And I was the social worker at the vocational site to help them kind of get jobs and do things differently. And as anyone would imagine, they came from really weak family structures. A lot of them didn't have a good family structure, but there was one woman whose son was in the program, and she came there every day to see him at lunchtime. And I just remember how his face would light up when she would show up. And it has such a positive effect on him. And I could see him excelling in a way that some of the other young men weren't. And I knew that difference was being made by his mother consistently showing up every day. I left that job because it was time to do my internship for my graduate program, my master's program. And I did my internship at a local methadone clinic. And one day I was walking to my office and the line for people to come and get their methadone, because back then you had to come and get your dose every single day. They wouldn't give you an extended amount because it was a controlled drug substance. And so I'm walking by and I look at the line of people standing to get their methadone. And who do I see in the line? That mom.
Mm.
And that, even working at the methadone clinic, I was still struggling emotionally with it. Cognitively understood it, but on a gut level, I didn't get it yet. And when I saw that mom in line, that was it for me. It changed everything, because if this treatment has her going from here to see her son every day, and that was making a huge difference in his life, then I'll take it. Because when she was on heroin on the street, she wasn't seeing him ever. And so this thing is supporting her and changing not only her life, but transforming the life of her child. And that moment was a real emotional shift for me. But from a biological perspective, you're exactly right. If anybody listening has ever had a coffee hangover, like you didn't get your cup of coffee in the morning, and so by 11 o'clock you have a little headache, and if you had to go 2 days you'd have a double headache. That is exactly what happens. Your brain has gotten used to the fact that you're going to give it a stimulant, and so it stops making a natural one to make room for what you're going to give it. Your brain is always trying to balance the books, and then when you suddenly don't give your brain what you've been giving it, it doesn't make it either. And so now there's a deficit, and now you have a headache. And so now you're going to take Tylenol or something, or you're going to go get that coffee because you're trying to get the balance back. So if the coffee can do that, let's talk about heroin. Heroin is so incredibly strong. It has a transformative effect on the brain's dopamine system. And so it starts making less because it's getting these loads from the outside. And it can get to the point where the capacity to even to make the chemicals that the brain needs is lost. And so the methadone fills in what the heroin was doing, but without the terrible negative effects of the heroin. So the dose of methadone that people get is not enough to make them high. And it blocks the effects of the heroin, even if they take it. So this is really, really important, because there's so many other things about addiction to get over just besides the feeling of the high. There are a lot of other things that come with the addiction and the life around it. And so if they can at least have this part taken care of, they can function well enough to build a new life. And some people use it temporarily, the dose is lowered and they can taper off. And some people need it for a really long time. But in that way, it's just like taking medication for any other mental illness. Something has gone wrong in the brain, right? So then moving to the theological side, for me, I found this answer in Romans chapter 7. It's one of the most familiar chapters we have, verses 14 through 24 or 5, when Paul is saying, what I don't want to do, I do. What I do want to do, I don't do. And he identifies a law in his members. That word members literally means body parts, like literal body parts. And we have to remember that the brain is a member. So there's a difference between your mind and your brain. And we often talk about our mind like they're the same thing, but they're not. And so Paul is saying there's a law in my member, my fallen flesh, warring against the law of Christ in my mind. He makes that distinction. And then he goes on to say, and sometimes the law in my member wins, taking me into captivity. So that means there were moments when what was going on in Paul's body was strong enough to overcome his effort to volitionally stick to the law of Christ in his mind. That's what it says on the page. I believe that that is the ultimate biblical definition of mental distress and illness. When a law in my member, my fallen nature, this body that just doesn't do what I want it to do, sometimes overtakes my volitional capacity. And yet, Paul remained a child of God. We don't see, he remained a child of God. And we know that earlier, Paul tells us that, I believe it's in Philippians, that he had been like a Pharisee, touching the law of God, blameless. So when Paul's talking about this, I do something I don't want to do, I'm skeptical that he's talking about a sinful action, Because if he never broke the law as a Pharisee, I can't imagine he started breaking it when Christ became his
Yeah.
Lord. And so, what is he
Yeah.
really talking about? I believe he was wrestling with an internal state because we feel our emotions in our body. And personally, I believe it was anxiety. We feel our emotions in our body so strong. I think Paul was saying, I don't want to feel like this. I don't want to be anxious. I don't want to worry. I don't want, but sometimes I do. Sometimes it wins, but then he goes on to say, right from chapter 7 to chapter 8, verse 1, but there's therefore now no condemnation to those who are in Christ Jesus. So when you read those verses together, instead of just starting with Romans 8:1, you
Right.
realize he says, I'm wrestling. Sometimes I lose, but I'm not condemned.
Yeah.
And to me, that is the answer that we have been asking God about mental health and illness. Where's it coming from? And how does it seem to affect us spiritually? And how can we suffer like this and still be God's children? And
Mm.
Paul gave us that answer right there.
There's so much.
The Bible has so much.
I know, but
Yes.
you said so much in just that little bit. It's like, okay, I want to talk about that, then I want to talk about that, then I want to
Let's
talk about this.
it.
So before we really kind of hone in on trauma, I wanted to just ask you, what mental health disparities do people of color experience? I mean, how is it, as a white family, some people might assume that we were able to get Matthew all the absolute care we needed. I have to say the mental health care system is pretty broken. It just is. And I think I haven't talked to anybody yet, from a parent to a person with lived experience to even a mental health professional. I have not talked to anybody yet who says it's all working well. So, but sometimes people think that because that we maybe had more access to care, both from financial stability and that we had good insurance, that surely we were able to get all the health care that we needed for Matthew, and we were not. And even if we had, it wasn't enough or put together in such a way. And then with him, he died by suicide. So clearly he was not able to access all that he needed. But when I add then to the fact that I know that people of color don't have always those same even advantages that we did, even how much harder then to get care that's needed. So just talk to us a little bit about that, in case some of the folks listening would really they'd like some hope, about that.
Sure. So there's disparities on both sides. There are disparities in mental illness risk, because people who are a member of what we call high needs populations are more at risk of mental health issues. And so poverty is a high need situation. Homelessness is a high need situation. Children in the foster care system are at high risk for mental health issues. And people of color are overrepresented in all of those groups. So there's already a risk exposure that's greater. But we don't always see higher rates, but we do see a higher risk exposure. So that's a disparity. Another disparity is the types of mental illnesses that we see diagnosed. PTSD and other trauma-related disorders are diagnosed more often among people of color versus a disorder like depression. We also have disparities in terms of misdiagnosis because of culture, how culture intersects with the way that people exhibit symptoms, or how culture intersects with the way symptoms are interpreted. We have overly high chance of being misdiagnosed. So
can you talk to us a little bit about that? Can you give some examples there, so we know exactly what you're talking about?
Sure. So for instance, Black children who actually have ADHD are more likely to be misdiagnosed as oppositional defiant disorder or conduct disorder. And so some of that can go to the cultural lens of the therapist, whether they have implicit or subconscious bias toward Black children and are more likely to have a more judgmental response to bad behaviors and not consider it ADHD, but move to oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder. So there can be some implicit bias in how those behaviors are interpreted. Black men are overdiagnosed, for instance, with schizophrenia. And they're overdiagnosed with schizophrenia based on the negative symptoms, which is based on what they're not doing versus what they are doing. So that's a real sticky place culturally because not everyone exhibits symptoms in the same way. A good example would be depression. For a long time, and it's getting much better, but for a long time, Black women were underdiagnosed with depression. But one of the central points about depression is that it disrupts daily behaviors. Are you experiencing these moods in a way that disrupts daily behaviors? But there are cultural differences in worldview around how you respond to sadness. And from one cultural lens, it's you aren't able to do anything. Through another cultural lens, you do it anyway. And so if that is a diagnostic element, the disruption of activity,
Sure.
then they could say, well, we don't see it here, but it's really just a different cultural manifestation. So it's
That's
really important that we recognize how culturally rooted mental health and illness is. There are some mental illnesses that don't exist in the United States that do exist in other cultural contexts. And so that can be really messy. And then finally, there's disparities in access to care. So access to culturally competent care, access to care in terms of finances, insurance, definitely. People of color, as I said earlier, overrepresented among those who live below the poverty line or near the poverty line, but also culturally competent care. Seeing a therapist of color is often very important to people of color in the same way that seeing a therapist who's a Christian is often very important to Christians, right?
right.
So I think that's
Right.
a good way to understand
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Because there is an experience that you assume as a Christian. There's certain experience that you think your therapist will share with you if they're a Christian. You assume that they're going to respect your wishes and beliefs and not try and push you in a direction that's different than those beliefs. So there's kind of a pre-established safety. Well, it's often the same way with women. Women might want to see women, men want to see men, and people of color often want to see a person of color because there's an expectation that there will be some shared experiences that they won't have to explain, including what it's like to be exposed to racial trauma every day. Racial trauma adds another layer to the other mental health difficulties that people are experiencing. And very often people want to feel like they're free to talk about that with a therapist of color, whereas a white therapist may not be familiar, may not understand it, may even disdain the idea. And so we want that person of color to feel safe to say, hey, I'm really having a hard time with what's happening racially in the country right now, and it's exacerbating my anxiety or my depression, without their therapist going, I don't believe in systemic racism. Well, that's a really bad issue
Right.
to have in your therapy room. And
Right.
so a lot of times we're looking for safety. We're all looking for safety. And for people of color, that's an element of the safety that we seek. But there are far less providers of color. I can't tell you how many notes and DMs I get from people saying, because of you, I decided to pursue a degree in counseling. You're the first therapist of color that I've ever seen, and then of faith as well. And so we're still working on increasing the number of therapists of color, but in the meantime, we also have to increase the quality of training for therapists who are white so that we don't have to wait for more therapists of color for everybody to get the help they need.
Mm. So you mentioned it, so I want to go kind of in that direction. And there's it's even hard to find the right words to describe what this last year has been for, I think, probably almost every person on the planet. I'm sure there are a few people who had a great year last year. I'm sure that they exist somewhere. But for the vast majority, the last 14 months have just been so rough. And you could, the list of the buckets, there's politics, there's COVID, there's racial trauma, then you put the things that happened in your own life that would have happened regardless of what was going on. People still got sick and died from other causes. People still went through divorces that didn't have anything to do with the pandemic. Children left their homes and ran from their, there's this rift between parents and children that had nothing to do with it. So there's been so much in just the last year that feels like it's, in some ways, it's harder to get the empathy that we need, because it's not like you can go through something and everybody's very empathetic, because everyone's
going
is
through
struggling.
something.
Everyone, and all of us have been in those same seas, that raging sea of COVID, that raging sea, at least if you live in the United States, of our political electing a president was a very traumatic event for everybody, regardless of where you were on the political
Yeah.
spectrum. It was really challenging. There was a lot of energy and emotion, and then when you get to the level of the Black men in particular, and women that were murdered, that were killed, that were in racially charged atmospheres. So then how do we comfort each other? How do we even identify what's going on within us? And along with that is, how do you know then when you need help, when everybody's struggling, when everybody's feeling low, when everybody's feeling a little bit traumatized? How do we in general know, okay, I need to seek some help, because it's moving beyond even my capacity to cope with it.
Mm-hmm.
And then apply that particularly to Black and Indigenous people of color who have those extra layers.
Sure.
It's really a big thing. So just like dive in and talk to us about all of that. Like, how do you know? How do you, when you need help in all of this, how do people of color, how do Black people in particular, now Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, with the extra trauma and violence aimed their way, trauma upon trauma upon trauma. What do we do, Dr. Anita?
It is a lot, and I'll dive in if I'm rambling. Interrupt me, but many
just
thoughts.
Go. Just
Fun,
talk.
You hit it on the head in defining trauma, something that overwhelms our ability to cope. And that's really critical, because people are living on a continuum between just like a challenging situation and a trauma, right? And I like to say that the degree of pain that we're in, how deep the pain goes, how it manifests, how long it lasts, and our ability to cope moves us on that continuum from something just being challenging to it truly being traumatic, right? To overwhelm our ability to cope. It can overwhelm our ability to cope spiritually, right? We talked about that kind of with my family, where you're left with these spiritual questions that threaten not necessarily your relationship with God, but perhaps your image of God, your definition of why God is even in my life. Is it to protect me? Is it to strengthen me? Is it so that good people have good outcomes? I mean, man, it can really shake your spiritual definitions. And even though you're still in a relationship with God, you still believe in God, you love him, you trust him, you don't feel as safe in the relationship. And that's something a lot of Christians don't like to admit, but that's a spiritual trauma, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've overwhelmed my spiritual capacities to cope. Emotionally, it can overwhelm our capacity to cope, so that we're not able to regulate our emotions in the same way that we're used to. Maybe we used to be sad for a minute if something happened, but now we're sad for hours or days. So losing our capacity to cope emotionally, mentally as well, to think, to concentrate, to be able to pull off tasks. It can be harder to do all of those things. Some people are noticing kind of a fog, that their brain just feels like they're in a fog, maybe overwhelming their ability to think. And then physically, our bodies are carrying all of this, because we're embodied creatures. So if people have noticed more headaches, more insomnia, digestive problems, weird aches and pains, that can be your body sending you a message that we are more than stressed. We are traumatized, and we need to discharge this work. So I really want to just expand that idea of trauma. If people feel that your ability to cope with things is diminished over time, you're moving in the direction of trauma, or you may already be there. And it's okay to name it that. And a lot of times people don't feel like they have the right to that title, because they know someone who lost a loved one to COVID, or lost a job, and you've had your job, you've had your home, your bills have been paid, no one's been sick, and you feel like you have all these blessings. But learning to exist at the intersection of grief and gratitude has really been the work of this time frame. All of us are grateful if we're here and alive right now. So there's the gratitude for the things we've had and haven't lost, but we've still experienced grief. And how do we balance that? So I want to give permission to people to call it trauma if that's what it is. It's real. And as far as when to get help, I say, you know what? Get it. I think everybody needs some help right now. If you go to a therapist and you have one session and they say, "What are you doing here? Go home." Great. But you know what? It's good to get help before you are sure you need it, because that means for a lot of people, you've gone to the end of your rope, and now you're in a more a scarier place. And so I think it's a great time for people to look for support, whether it's from an actual individual therapist. Support groups, online support groups, I think are a tremendous thing for people to access, and there's one for just about everything in the world. If you Google it, Celebrate Recovery, of course,
Right.
amazing support groups. But getting together with people who are going to through the same thing and just talking about it can help. Many people think, why talk about it if I can't do anything about it? But it turns out that talking actually does help. So that's really important. And one more thought I had about this kind of mass trauma, this collective trauma that we're in, that influences the way we have experiences. I ask people to think about who your we is, because a collective trauma like COVID has been, the racial unrest that we've seen, collective traumatizing, the political unrest, like you said, collective trauma. But where it hits us depends on the we's that we identify with.
Huh.
And you're a part of the we based on just how long it stays with you. I can see something on the news that's really traumatizing, but if I forget about it as soon as it's not in the headlines, then that wasn't a we situation for
Oh,
me.
that's good.
But who
Keep
are
going. That's really
who
practical.
are your
That's a
true
practical.
we's? Do
Yeah.
you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
so there was a we in the church community and in some portions of the church community who felt like religious liberty was being restricted. That was a we. There's we racially, there's we as Americans, there's we as
Yeah.
humans exposed to COVID.
Yeah.
There's all these we's. For me, there's we as a Black person, we as a Black woman, as a Black mother. That's a we that stays with me. We as people of faith, I've been so deeply concerned about what's happening in the body of Christ at the intersection of faith and racism. So that's a double we, double whammy we. So the collective trauma is really about the we's that you identify with. And what stories are we telling amongst our we about what we're going through and what meaning is going to
That's
be
really
applied
good. I hadn't
by the
heard it.
we.
I've heard of we've used the phrase "me too." I
Mm-hmm.
mean, we particularly talked about that with, people who had experienced sexual abuse in, either in a work context or a faith context.
Mm-hmm.
We've used "me too," but there are so many "me toos,"
Yeah.
and so I've heard of that, but I like the "we" as well, because what I like about that is "me too" says that's me. I experience
Individually.
that, but the
Mm-hmm.
"we" also it instantly puts me in the context of a community, a larger community. Me too
Mm-hmm.
does too, but "we" just gives a different perspective.
No, it's a very different perspective.
I'm looking at even the suffering of a group. Um, not the focus is not really just on me. It is me in the context of that group,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a good way of phrasing it.
Yeah, and I
I
think
think
it's
that's
going to be
helpful.
interesting. We already see it happening, but the we's are developing very different narratives.
Mm, mm,
And those narratives become transgenerational. Well, these are the stories that we will tell about this time frame and what happened. And so, because the we's are developing such different narratives, that could make some hardship for a long time. So, as a we, as a person of color, looking at racial trauma, racial violence, and what it's been like, and then for me, it's been particularly painful to have a we of the church
mm,
and the splits where not feeling like the church at large is supporting the we that is me as a person of color. It's almost like an identity split. It's a pain that's breaking up a we, you know, and that's really hard. So that's a trauma in itself. So if people are part of groups whose stories are diverging at this time, tearing at the fabric,
yeah,
forcing people into a different we,
yeah.
that's a real hardship. And so I believe that's been
Talk to us
especially
about
hard for people of color.
talk to you know talk to me, because you and I have been together this week at a training that we've been doing here
Hmm.
at Saddleback for some of our staff around for racial justice and becoming anti-racist. And maybe some of those, again, we weren't necessarily for sure going to talk about that, but I feel like that's where we're going with this. Give us a little, I heard you define some terms yesterday in a training that we did. You don't have to go through all of them, but like I just, that even that term anti-racist,
Hmm.
and how can the So not just the defining of the terms, but what can the Church of Jesus Christ do at this moment, at this juncture, this
Mm-hmm.
intersection of what is happening in around racial injustice, around maybe an awakening in probably majority white space churches. I would say there's at least conversations. We're having conversations that we haven't had before
Mm-hmm.
in our church, and I know there are other churches around the country that are trying to stick their at least their big toe in the water and say we can't keep responding or not responding. By not responding, it is a response,
Right.
but
Right.
we can't stick our head in the sand. We can't ignore. We can't pretend. This is this is a cultural and a faith moment for the Church of Jesus Christ. So, just tell us a little bit about, like, when I say the word, when I said we're trying to become an anti-racist church, and you've
Mm-hmm.
helped us with that, what do we mean by that, as your understanding? And then at the larger viewpoint of what the church and the faith community, how can we take these moments and make them true God moments?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So, talking about being anti-racist is, I think I said to our group that for racism to not be safe anywhere at church.
Mm.
It shouldn't be safe anywhere. So it's not just an individual thing. It's a we thing. It's not, well, I'm not personally racist, and so long as I'm not racist, then I don't need to do anything. But to be anti-racist is to say, I'm going to make it unsafe for racism to exist anywhere in a sphere where I have influence. I think that's a really good way to look at it. And because so often, because we associate racism with sin, and we should, people are looking for sins of commission. What did I do that was racist? And if I haven't done anything, then I'm not racist. I haven't committed this sin, or I'm not guilty of this sin. But what have I not done? What about the sins of omission? And anti-racism is about making sure that I'm not guilty of sins of omission. What should I have been doing that I did not do? And making sure that racism isn't safe anywhere in the body of Christ. I don't want it to be safe anywhere in the world, but as a person of faith, especially, I don't want racism to be safe anywhere in the body of Christ. And so it's an active stance to make sure that I don't fall into the sin of omission, which is that I didn't take action to do what was necessary. We often use the story of the Good Samaritan and the man on the side of the road who had been robbed and beaten and was of a different ethnic group, one that was not friendly with the Samaritans. Not only did he stop and see to that person, but he took that person to get medical care, paid for the care, said, I'll be back. If you need anything else, I'm going to bring some more money. That's action, that's sustained. It's a commitment to continue forward to the care of others. And the Bible so clearly directs us to care for the oppressed, even if that hasn't been emphasized in your processes of spiritual formation. Just because an ingredient was left out doesn't mean it's not supposed to be there. So this is a big time of stretching for the church to see God more broadly, in a deeper way, and to begin to recognize that some things may have been left out of how I was discipled and how I was trained because of cultural bias in our approaches to the word. But now we need to fix that. And I think one of the most important things, talking about collective trauma, one of the most important things that the church at large needs to do is be willing to rewrite their story. When we have a mass trauma, people are writing, as I said, their we stories. And so how this story will be told in the Black community in years to come, how it will be told for Americans in the year to come, whoever your we is. But when there's a collective trauma, we who are traumatized have a story to tell. But when the perpetrator of the trauma tells the story, that's a question too. And very often, in order to maintain group identity, when a group has been guilty of imposing a trauma on another group, the story is incomplete. People, and this isn't just church, this is sociological research. This is what human beings do. They leave parts of the story out so that they can create a story that reaffirms and allows them to keep their collective identity. If we take on responsibility for the trauma as a part of our collective story, then we have to somehow reshape our identity or dismiss that identity or detach from that identity. And so for many generations, The church, American church, is a powerful story, right? And that story is going to need to be reworked to include in its identity that some trauma was imposed on others. Native Americans, Black enslaved people, Asian Americans as well, Latino Americans, that trauma that's being imposed on another group. How do you take responsibility for that? And I would love to see the leadership of the church, particularly white churches. Yes, I know that all of those people who did it back when are dead and gone, and it wasn't you. But if you associate with the legacy of the church as a we, if you talk about the forefathers of the church as a we, then you don't get to dismiss the crimes of the we. And that's the type of cherry picking storytelling that's so dangerous, and it devastates the hearts of members of color because you're not willing to incorporate my pain into your story in order to maintain your identity in a way that seems innocent. And so in order to do this, frankly, white church leadership is going to need to be willing to display, model what it looks like to rewrite that story and to build an identity of a generation that righted wrongs, because that's a beautiful identity as well. We don't have to absorb it and then just be guilty forever, but absorb it and then take responsibility for it and be the champions that righted the wrongs and made the story so much more honest and true. But in order to do that, and this is the last thing I'll say, 'cause I feel like I'm going on and on, but in order to do that,
I'm listening.
it's critical. They are going to have to listen to people of color. You can't rewrite the story from your perspective. You need to be humble enough to take what people of color are telling you and not just cherry pick the parts you like and then go on to say, no, we're going to rewrite the story in a way that works for us. We're going to rewrite the story. Your audience for this rewrite really should be people of color, because it's a repentance and an embrace and a new identity. The audience should really be people of color, and your peers in the white church should then be watching you to see a model of how they ought to now behave. And very often the temptation is for white leadership to make the white church their audience. I'm going to try and change you. I'm going to put it in your language. I'm going to try to focus here, and then not allow that story to be shaped by those who are wounded. Let's shape the story with those who are wounded. Let them be the audience and let others observe and follow suit. And that's a very different perspective. I hope that made sense.
Oh, it makes a lot of sense. It just raised, a whole bunch of other questions or other little side things that I want to, so this and then this and this. So we have just a few minutes left, but one of the things that I heard you say yesterday along this line in our training that I just found really helpful. It says what you just said, but it put it in probably the lowest form of, like, put the cookies on the lowest shelf. You were talking about, you said, every family has a weird uncle or whatever. And you said, so when you tell your family story, I mean, you tell it, it's your story, your example, but you were using that to say, as we tell the truth about our family as a country, our family as a church, it's your story, you tell it, but I mean, I just thought that made it like nobody could not understand it when you put it in that language.
It's like the story of the family secret, right? So many families have a secret or something that they would prefer not to talk about, right? And so you've talked about sexual abuse before. Sexual abuse runs in families. It's incredible, generation after generation, not only victims, but perpetrators. And it's a psychological phenomena that blows our minds, because we don't suspect that perpetrators are teaching each other to perpetrate because of the secrecy around it, but it keeps going. It's the same way with mental illness running in families and someone not wanting to talk about the fact that their uncle had schizophrenia or their mom had depression. But when you keep those secrets, you limit the capacity of future generations to take care of themselves, because they don't know what they're at risk of. They don't know what's gone wrong. They won't know how to contextualize the pain when it arises, because they don't have the whole story. And it's really the same with our faith story, with the history of the church, with America's story. We can't just go and leave out that uncle that did that awful thing, or that grandfather that did that awful thing. We need to tell the whole story if future generations are going to be healthier. And by hiding it, we fail the future. We fail the future. And it's so important that we not do that. And so we are going to have to own our whole family story. That doesn't mean we don't love our whole family, but we also need to sometimes hold our family accountable when they do wrong things and then make a difference for it, for future generations. So, yeah, we're going to have to tell the whole story. And when we want to tell a story of healing, we need to ask the people in the family who were wounded what they need, and then give them what they need. And when we model giving people what they need, that's how we correct it.
Well, and you also said, you said it a minute ago, but I wanted to just reiterate it because you almost said it exactly the same way again, but I thought it was so important, is believe when someone tells you their story of woundedness.
Yes.
Believe them.
Believe them.
And just tell us how that would apply, particularly around the story of race in the United States. Tell me where that sentence means so much.
It's one of the things that continues to contribute to racial trauma, and it's so hurtful for me as a Black woman, and I know for other people in the community of color, is not being believed upfront. What just happened was racist. Why do you say that? How do you know? Let's wait for the facts. Well, I can imagine. Well, maybe. No. We need you to trust the voice of the wounded. And I also want people to kind of flip that and ask themselves what it means for them not to trust, because it means that the person who's telling you about their wound, and in the group of racism, in the issue of racism, this thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people are saying the same story. You're saying that we are either not intelligent enough to understand what's happening to us, we are delusional as a group, we're lying as a group, we're gullible. I mentioned, so many people have said to me, well, it's just because the media pushes the narrative of racism and that's why they feel that way. And it's like, do you really think that I just heard on the news that I'm oppressed and have no personal experience? So when you're choosing to slowly believe or not entirely believe, I challenge anyone to ask themselves, what am I saying about the person who's talking to me? What am I saying about the group who's expressing themselves when I'm slow to believe? Because really, it diminishes the group. And that's on the continuum of racism. To say this group of people doesn't know what happened to them, they aren't intelligent enough to tell their story, they aren't intelligent enough to know what's going on around them, well, that would be racism. But that story for many people is better than, wow, I could have been functioning for the last 40 years with incredible blind spots that would change the way I felt about myself. And the idea of having to accept that change is so upsetting. It causes so much cognitive dissonance that many times my white brothers and sisters emotionally respond by rejecting it. They're not willing to change the way they see themselves in an area. And to preserve their own identity, they will reject my suffering. And that's a problem.
I think so much of the difficulty we have, we'll kind of close with this. Well, I'm going to ask you, you can think about this, but I'm just going to ask you sort of like, what is, you've said it, but if you just capsulate it for us at the end, kind of what your hope is, even as we're in just where we are and where we're headed, both in the church around mental health and around racial. So I'll come back to that at the end. But if I didn't just make myself lose my train of thought, I remember it. If I go too far afield, it's like, what was I saying?
Get it.
Was just as human beings, we have such a hard time telling secrets. We have such a hard time really looking at reality in our lives, no matter what it is. It's just difficult. It's, I don't know if it is just this combination of it hurts too much sometimes to actually put the facts out there, because then suddenly you have to deal with either the hurt or the wounding or the betrayal or the abuse or the shame, whatever it is. It's so painful to look at. Yeah. And then secondly, it always makes us go, well, was any of that, did I bring that on? Was that my fault? Did I have a role? And sometimes the answer, I'm not talking about in sexual abuse, but sometimes like when we're talking about racial trauma, all that's happened, to say, yes, there were things wrong done in the country that I love so dearly. And so there's first of all, it's so painful. And then secondly, it's, is there any culpability, personal? And then what do I do about it? I can't change what happened, even if it is as bad as somebody else says. I can't change it. I can't make it different. I can't fix it, or it seems too big. And so for whatever reason, we're more content to let all of that sit inside of us. Again, whether it was over sexual abuse, or whether it was violence in our home, or whether it was something that was done to us, something that we did that we can't own up to. If it looks at our nation's history, if it looks at maybe the particular denomination in church that we belong to, and how was that denomination formed? Well, some denominations were formed expressly over the issue of slavery. One group of people said, we will be slave owners, and you can't tell us we can't. And if you try to tell us we can't, we will form our own denomination. And just looking at all of those things. And so I think what I'm trying to get at is, what I take from a lot of what we've said today is a prayer that God would allow us to look at our lives honestly. Maybe somebody, if you take it out of this into the area of mental health, maybe you or somebody you love really does need help. You need help. Somebody you love needs help, but you just can't quite either get there yourself, or your loved one won't. And so you don't talk about it. And so it persists and the wounds continue. So I'm just praying that God allows us to see truth wherever it is today that we need to see truth. It may be something so personal. It may be collective in our country. It may be collective about the church that you're a part of. But wherever it is, that God would allow us to see his truth, and then that we would not run from that truth, when we see it, but we would be willing to do the hard work then of looking at it in the light, not letting it stay in the darkness any longer. And then that God would give us the courage to make changes, repair, seek help, repent, draw closer to him so that we are more filled with his love. It just feels like it all comes down to a place of being willing to see, being willing to see wherever it is, and then let God do his work. He cannot do it in the darkness. He can't do it with lies, with half-truths, with cover-ups, with denials. It's got to be, we have to start with the truth. So we're going to pray about that in a minute, but just maybe any other words that you would say of places that you have of hope, or somebody maybe who's really struggling today. Just a word to them.
For those who are suffering in silence, I'll start that with that, who have the mental health problems that they don't want to talk about, who have survived a sexual abuse, who are struggling with racial trauma. There's a shame that can be associated with being the victim of abuse, because why wasn't I strong enough, smart enough, committed enough, prayed enough to have avoided this? Yes, these bad things are happening, but I should have been stronger, faster, smarter, better in order for it to not get me. And so a lot of times the shame begins to attach to the admission of vulnerability. I have been damaged. Something happened that someone else did, and I was hurt by it. And to admit that we can be hurt that deeply sometimes just makes us feel awful and even more vulnerable. So we avoid it, or we feel like it says something negative about us, and that shame is there. And so I just want to acknowledge those feelings, and encourage people to begin to tell their story in safe places. I've often been heard saying that trauma destroys relationships, but relationships can destroy trauma. Trauma separates us from people because of shame. But when we find safe relationships actually can be the healing thing, whether it's a relationship with a therapist, but also just with someone else who understands and who will listen to me without judgment and remind me of who God made me to be before any of this happened, before there was a man to till the ground, before it ever rained on the ground, anything. God formed me, and I'm still that person. And so many people need to hear that, because they feel like trauma made them. And I love to remind people that trauma didn't make you. It may have shaped you,
Mm,
sure, but it didn't make you.
that's
And
good.
healing is just being reshaped again into our original form.
That's
And
good.
there's growth after that, that we can grow when we
Yeah.
after we heal and recover. So I want to encourage people who have suffered with that. For those who are struggling with possibly being part of a we who
Mm,
hurt another group, like you said, and it happened so long ago, what can I do about it now? The events may have happened a long time ago, but the effects are happening now. And so, what you can do is be committed to disrupting the effects because abuse is not, it hasn't stopped until its effects have stopped.
mm,
When I work with sex abuse survivors, one of the things that I tell them is my goal, to the extent I'm allowed to have a goal for them, is to be able to boldly declare I was abused, but I'm not anymore. That the
mm,
abuse didn't stop necessarily when the abuser went away or the
yeah.
abuser died or left, but the echoes of the symptoms of that abuse, it's still going on. But I have the capacity to take control of that and say, not anymore. And so if you are part of a we that historically has traumatized other we's, intervening in the effects is what you can do. And if you choose not to do that intentionally, then you are moving into being a part of the we that is actually committing the trauma by omission, by refusing to help, by disrupting the effects. And it is possible to do that. And I know you've talked a lot about it in your space. There's books you can read,
Yeah.
look
Yeah.
up
We
the
can put those
history.
in the
Yeah,
notes.
find
But
out
that
about it. But yeah, take
that
that
makes
action.
well that just makes me, I meant to say this earlier. I really wanted to, and we had so many we had so many rich things to talk about. I didn't, but I really do want to talk about how, just briefly as we close, that there was a guilty verdict this week for
Yeah.
Derek Chauvin in the George Floyd murder trial. And that while it was a step toward accountability, I know that there have been a lot of conflicting
Yeah.
emotions that people might be holding. So if you wouldn't just mind giving us a few words about how can people, hold their grief for
Mhm.
injustice that hasn't been addressed or hasn't been acknowledged or no one has been held accountable for. And yet also I felt joy. I can only speak for myself. I had a moment of joy and relief. That was just my personal experience,
Mm.
but the conflicting experience of, yes, there was accountability, and yet there's more, or there's stuff
Mhm.
that won't be addressed. And can you just give us a little, how do we hold both of those sets of emotions?
Yeah, that's what it is. It's about, I mentioned earlier about living at this intersection of grief and gratitude, but it's even harder than that in this case because I know as a Black woman, I'm so grateful that it turned out the way that it did, but I'm also a little angry that I should be grateful that a system worked.
Mm.
The fact that the system is supposed to work means no one has to be grateful for it. You know what I mean? Like
Yes.
it's supposed to
Right.
work.
Right. Right.
And so it's like, I'm grateful that it worked in this instance. I'm angry that I should be grateful for a system of justice to work. I am happy for the accountability. I would rather have George Floyd's life. I think of his family and how they will continue to live without him
They will miss
forever.
him forever.
Forever, right? Forever. And then there was another police shooting on the same day. And man, it is a lot. It is a lot. But I felt, for me personally, I felt relief. I felt a different kind of grief. Um, but I did also feel some hope. I did also feel some hope. So I'm nurturing that hope.
Yeah.
Just that, like trying to start a fire when you're like rubbing this two sticks together and and it starts to smoke and you're like
Yeah.
blowing on it a little,
Yeah.
like don't let it slip away. I feel
Yeah.
like that's the place of hope where I'm just kind of blowing on a flame that I hope will burst into something bigger. Um,
Amen.
yeah, that's kind of where I am, and
Thank you.
so
Thank you.
it's part of my story now.
Yep. Mine too.
Yes,
Not in the
and we're
same way.
part of each other's story now
Yeah.
because we were together when that verdict came in, and you were my first hug about it, and that was very healing for me as well. So thank you for that moment, even though we were doing something official at the time, that we just broke to be together in that moment, and so you're part of my story too, and it was a healing moment. Thank you so much for that.
I know it, my experience of it is different simply because we're coming from different places and different points of view culturally and ethnically, but I want you to know it was unforgettable. I will not forget where I was.
Yeah. We became a we in that moment together.
We did.
We became a we. We're a we.
did.
And it's not impossible. We don't have to be the same color to become a we.
Yeah.
But your embrace of our pain
Mm.
and the actions you've been willing to take
Mm.
is what made us a we in that moment.
Yeah.
All the kindling was there already, made us a we in that moment. And so we're a we now.
I like
That's
that.
the goal.
I like that.
Yeah.
Well, let me just pray for us.
Please.
Father, thank you for this time with Dr. Anita. Thank you for her willingness to share deeply from her life, from her experience, from her research, from her lived experience, from her pain, from her hope. God, I ask that all who have listened today have been drawn into those same conversations. Things aren't always neat and tidy. Our lives are messy and our circumstances are messy, and we give it our best shot, and still, even with our best effort, we make messes or messes happen around us. And so just to be able to say that to each other today and still believe that you are good and believe that you are working in our lives and in our messes, in our pain and our sorrow. God, as I said earlier, I am just struck by this deep need to see and know the truth in all aspects of our lives. God, we all as individuals have different needs of where we need to see truth. But for people who need it around their mental health or the mental health of their loved ones, I pray that this call today would be a reminder that, yes, this is a serious problem. And yes, we do need help, and not be afraid or ashamed to ask. Lord, if it has to do with our spiritual life, of seeing how we've drifted maybe from you and are actually having a very hard time accessing our relationship and feeling close, feeling that you are near, that you are at work, for those who are struggling to find those touch points with you, God, may they also reach out here online or to someone else or to a counselor or to a friend, to a support group, somebody that will just remind them that you love them and that they are important to you. God, for these places where we've talked about racial tension, racial injustice, racial, the history in our country and in our faith community, that we would be willing, in particular, the white church, to, not because of our skin color, but because of just the ability that we've had, the privilege of being so many advantages in our favor through these years, these centuries, these decades, that we would look through a different set of lenses, that our hearts would be filled with compassion for fellow human beings, and that we would be willing to see truth, not run from it, not shy away from it, not dismiss it. God, make us better listeners to each other's pain. Forgive us for those places where we make people apologize for their own pain or defend their pain or explain it to us or prove it to us. God, that is so wrong. You are not that way. You don't make us prove our pain to you. You don't make us defend our hurt. You see it, you receive it, and we see so clearly from your word that your response is compassion. Your response is to touch, to heal, to remove the pain, to remove the barriers, to remove the things, the evil that have been breaking us into pieces. God, may we be better models and examples of that kind of love for each other, accepting each other's pain, hearing it, bearing it together, doing what we can to carry it, and doing what we can to change the future that looks more like you. God, bless Anita, bless her family, bless her work, her ministry, all that she does in your name for people who are hurting and who need encouragement. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you
Amen.
so much for
Thank
being
you.
with us. It's just been a privilege and a joy.
I enjoyed it. Thank you so much for having
Thank
me.
you so much. Everybody, we will see you next month with Dr. Bruce Perry. You are going to love Dr. Bruce Perry as you've loved, I know, Dr. Anita. Bye, everybody. See you.